Well, good afternoon, friends. My name is Mark Valeri, and on behalf of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, I welcome you to this afternoon's presentation and discussion. Our speaker is Michael Hoberman, Professor of American Literature at Massachusetts' Fitchburg State University. Michael has written widely about the Jewish experience in America. He will speak with us especially today about his latest book, Imagining Early American Jews. But he's also written 100 Acres of America, the Geography of Jewish American Literary History. In addition to this, he has contributed to Tablet Magazine and the Jewish Review of Books and other venues. This year, he is a senior research fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is working on the ways in which ideas of wilderness have shaped the perspectives of Jewish Americans through a study of the early life of Theodore Solomons, a California-born explorer of the high Sierras. After the talk, we'll have some questions and answers for you to engage, Michael, and there will be a reception just outside to which you are all warmly welcome. So let's welcome to WashU in St. Louis, Michael Hoberman.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Danforth Center. Thank you, Abram, for having me and taking me to lunch today, and for people who've shown up to hear this talk. I'm going to keep you in suspense about that cover image. I deliberately chose what I think of as sort of an intriguing cover image, and I will talk about why you're looking at a synagogue through the lens of a phone, but I won't get to that until towards the end of the talk. But you can use your imagination and try to anticipate why it might be that I did that. So one of the most important points of distinction of this book from my perspective is that it is not an introduction to early Jewish American history, and the reason I haven't written an introduction to early Jewish American history is that has been done very well by many, many scholars. I mean, you can point, at least over the last 50 years, there's been really excellent archival scholarship that introduces people to the lives of Jews in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and earlier than that. So I'm not doing that so much as what I'm looking at in this book is how that early history of Jews in America has been interpreted by Jews through the generations, and particularly in the contemporary time, how that history means different things in different ways for different people, in accordance with shifting political, ideological, and cultural needs that occur. So for that reason, the key word here is imagining, because what we're doing is we're imagining the lives of earlier American Jews. We really can't capture them in any other way but through the imagination. And the other component as well to the word imagining is my focus in this book is on popular images, right? So again, historians have done excellent work at relaying, with some degree of historical verisimilitude, the actual lives of these people. And I'm more interested in looking at how popular writers, fiction writers, historical novelists, museum curators have taken that early history and presented it for the purposes of popular audiences. So that's another component for the use of the word imagining. So I'm going to start here with this familiar recent image for you, not because I want to talk politics with you today, although this is the Center for Religion and Politics, but just to remind all of us that it's not just Jews, it's not just American Jews, but it really is all people, and specifically in our context, American people have long been in the practice of looking at history and taking images from history in order to better understand and navigate the crises of the present. So No King's Day is a good example of that, right? And I'll just leave it at the point where essentially what is happening here is people, in this case on the political left, are invoking the legacy, the image, the ideas of 1776 for the purpose of better understanding and navigating a current political crisis. A few years ago, we had the 1619 Project, which basically from the lens of the immediate place of Black Lives Matter and that sort of thing. We're looking at the earlier history of the United States. This was a project undertaken by journalists, photographers, documentarians, and various cultural workers, looking at American history with fresh eyes, trying to understand particularly the racial impasses and the racial injustices, how they got to be that way. So in order to do that, the legacy of 1619, the legacy of the slave trade as sort of the be-all and end-all point of origin for American culture was invoked by the 1619 Project. Now, this happens on the right as well. It's not only people on the left who will invoke early American history in order to better understand and better articulate whatever their political visions are. You have examples, Christian nationalists suggesting that the United States should be and always has been a Christian republic. They too look to early American history in order to demonstrate, in order to develop the case that they want to make for their argument. Or, as you see, Doug Wilson invoking the history of the slave trade in Charleston, South Carolina, in order to, from his perspective, better understand and better frame current urban crises in America. So on both the left and the right, the legacy of early American history is constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted for various reasons. Now, Jews have participated in this, both in order to comprehend an overall understanding of American history, but also more specifically, and what I'll be talking about today, is how to better understand their history within American culture. Very often American Jews, for generations, have looked at earlier episodes in American Jewish history in order to understand where we are today and our place in the nation. The first example that I can give you of an American Jew doing this comes from 1800, the first self-conscious, self-aware example of this. So what you see on the left-hand side is the manuscript version of a speech that was given at Columbia College in 1800 by a man named Samson Simpson. Samson Simpson was an interesting name and a difficult one to say more than once. Samson Simpson was probably the first Jewish graduate of Columbia College. And in those times, in the turn of the 19th century, the practice at American colleges, whether you're talking about Columbia or William and Mary, would be that there would be several commencement speeches given. And some of these commencements, they would be short, like commencement speeches have to be. And some of them were given in English on various topics of the day, but very often these speeches were given in Latin and Greek. And it happened that in 1800, Columbia decided that one of their commencement speeches was going to be delivered in Hebrew. And they decided that they might as well appoint a person who could read Hebrew in order to deliver this speech. So Samson Simpson, this young, maybe 20-year-old man who had basically, as far as I can tell, had studied for his bar mitzvah, but that's probably as far as his Hebrew studies had gone. He was the appointed person to deliver this speech. He was not the person to write the speech. Right? The speech was written by somebody else. The speech was written by a man named Gershom Mendes Seixas, who was the Hazan, the lay leader of Sharith Israel, which was the Jewish congregation in New York at this time. So Seixas writes this, it's about a speech that probably wouldn't have taken more than 3 or 4 minutes to read. He writes this speech, and Samson Simpson is the person who gives the speech. And what is the topic of the speech? Well, the topic of the speech is the history of Jews in North America. So that's why I say it's really the first time that an American Jew looked back at Jewish history in North America and presented it to a public audience, right, whoever was assembled for this graduation ceremony. In fact, the speech more or less went back 150 years to the arrival of the first Jews in New Amsterdam in the 1650s, and it essentially relayed the story of Jews, particularly in the city of New York, leading up to the year 1800. But a very important point to consider here is that 1800, of course, was a year of a extreme political polarization, an extremely fraught political electoral moment in American history. And so it's my contention that when Seixas wrote this speech, he was basically capitalizing on an opportunity to demonstrate Jewish loyalty to the nation. Jews by reputation in 1800 were overwhelmingly Jeffersonian in their partisan politics, and Seixas was one of these people. So he felt it necessary in this case to tell his audience, which was presumably comprised of Federalists as well as Jeffersonians, well, look, we've been here since 1650. We loyally served in the American Revolution. We established our synagogue as soon as we could. We participated in the civic life of the city, and this goes back 150 years. So I think for my purposes, it's really the first instance of a self-aware American Jew delivering the news of Jewish history to a popular audience, in this case comprised almost entirely of non-Jews. Right? Now, by the way, you might be wondering, how did these people understand the speech? It was given in Hebrew. And so all we can really say is that there was a brief summary of the speech that was published in English, and the summary tells you what you need to know, which is that the contents of the speech was the history of Jews in New York. So people knew at least that's what they were hearing about. Now, we advanced the clock 95 years to 1895, and here is another prominent American Jew. This is Simon Wolf, a very well assimilated German Jew of this period, who in 1895 publishes this book, which is not really compelling reading. If you're about to check this out from the library, I'll just tell you ahead of time that essentially its entire contents are just the names of Jewish men who served in American military conflicts going back to the 7 Years' War, right up to the Spanish, not up to the Spanish-American War. It's published in 1895, right up through the Civil War. The point being that Wolf, again, felt that it was necessary to deliver a message both to Jews and to non-Jews about the longevity of the Jewish presence in North America and about the loyalty that Jews had expressed, in this case, through their military service. I think in this case, my understanding, my interpretation of it is that Wolf had two audiences in mind here. One audience would have been non-Jews who were very, let's say, discomfited by the idea of, right, this 1895 is when you have an enormous influx of Eastern European Jews, a couple million of them showing up in Lower Manhattan during a very brief period of time. And so non-Jewish Americans, particularly members of, let's say, the Anglo establishment, are feeling very nervous about this influx. And so Wolf's book is reminding them, well, look, we've been here a long time. We serve the Republic loyally. The other audience I think he has in mind are these new Jews, many of whom only spoke Yiddish, who needed to be reminded that, well, you know what, you are joining the ranks of a Jewish experiment that has been underway here since the 1600s, right? You are not the first Jews to get here. You have been preceded by generations of us who have established ourselves as, again, members of the military and, founders of cities and so on. So there's Wolf in 1895. Now we're going to advance the clock, right? Because really the primary area that my book looks at is much more recently. So 1975, maybe some of us are, I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial well enough. A year before the bicentennial, the U.S. Postal Office issued this stamp commemorating Haim Solomon. Very briefly, Haim Solomon is sort of the stuff of American Jewish legend, right? He's a Polish-born Jew who comes to North America just at the beginning part of the American Revolution, settles in Philadelphia, loans an unknown but presumably enormous amount of money to the Continental Congress to help prosecute the war against Great Britain. So he needs to be commemorated in time with the American bicentennial. And then more recently still, as in like a week from now, right, I think the date on here is April 23rd, 2026. So this is an event that's about to happen next week in Philadelphia, where I'm currently living. The Weitzman Museum of American Jewish History is about to host a big special exhibition and conference on the legacy of the First Salute, which very briefly I'll describe what this is about. So in keeping with the 250th anniversary of the United States, Jews who are commemorating the Jewish participation in the American Revolution are invoking the history of St. Eustatius, which was a Dutch island in the Caribbean where there was a lot of privateering activity during the Revolutionary War. It was a haven for American privateers, many of whom were Jews. And when the British Admiral Rodney decided to crack down on these largely Jewish privateers, he burned the synagogue in St. Eustatius and imprisoned the Jewish traders of St. Eustatius. It's really an unknown, relatively unknown episode in the American Revolution, while the Weizmann Institute is calling great attention to it as being a pivotal moment in the American Revolution. So there you have it. As recently as a week from now, these moments in American Jewish history seem to warrant commemoration and attention, again, for reasons that American Jews today will invoke, having to do with a need to assert their loyalty, assert their participation. Of course, this can get complicated, and part of what my book is about is how that legacy shifts around, because when the politics change, and the meanings of certain things change, then the history, which doesn't change, gets interpreted in different ways. I'll try to explain more what I mean in connection with this slide. So, of course, many people are aware that Jews have been in the South going back to the 1600s, right? I think Charleston, the first Jew arrives in Charleston in 1695. And of course, there is a rich literature, scholarly literature on Jews in the Civil War, particularly in the South, the North as well. This book was published in 2000, and I only chose it. I don't want to beat up on this author, who I think has written a pretty scholarly, accountable work on the history of Jewish Confederates. But just to pick up on the image, right, the idea of Jews, Confederates, heroes. Well, again, are Confederates heroes? Are Jews heroes for joining the Confederate cause? Maybe in 1930 or 1920 or 1900 or 1950, Southern Jews would have proudly embraced this history. But of course, for obvious reasons, people are discomfited by it more recently. And so what does that do to the history? The stories themselves don't change, but our interpretations and our popular images of those stories shift around. Case in point, right? So if we're looking at Southern Jewish history, probably the most famous Jewish Confederate was Judah Benjamin, who served 3 different posts in the Confederate cabinet, including Secretary of State during the final years of the Confederacy. It's an interesting story, which during the Q&A, if somebody's curious, I don't want to get bogged down in the story of this monument, but essentially a monument was set up to him. I think this is in Charlotte, North Carolina. A monument was set up in his memory, where the community, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, pressured a Jewish community in Charlotte to put this monument up. The Jews of Charlotte complied. They put the monument up, and then in 2020, it received this spray-painted image that says BLM on it. The monument is not there anymore. So again, the history doesn't change, but the meanings and the implications of the stories change through time. The South is a storied part of American history, and so Jews glomming onto the Jewish Southern legacy is one part of the story, but then, of course, the West is also the stuff of legend, right? And so here you have an image that's reproduced in several works on Jews on the frontier, Jews in the American West. The person on the very far right of this image is a man named Solomon Bebo, who was born in Germany and ended up coming to New Mexico with his brothers, opening a large retail establishment in New Mexico. And then Bebo, for a period of time, I think maybe a year or two, was actually the governor, elected the governor of the Acoma Pueblo. He married an Acoma Pueblo woman. He settled there. And so that's part of the story, is the popularity of this image in more than one coffee table book about Jews on the frontier. But more recently, this short film was made, which basically fictionalizes Solomon Bebo's story, and in particular, his relationship to these native people in New Mexico and his romance and marriage to this Acoma Pueblo woman. So it's the stuff of legend, and my book is really interested in, what these legends mean, why we pass them on, what it means about American Jews that they care so much, so deeply. At one point, let's say, again, if you turn the clock back, at one point, the popular stories about Jews on the frontier were stories about Jewish gunfighters and Jewish sheriffs and Jewish lawmen, and then eventually we get to hearing the stories shift around, so now we're hearing about alliances and sympathy between Jews and Native people. Again, it happens in accordance with shifting ideas about what the history of Native Americans means to Americans today, as opposed to what it might have meant 100 years ago.
What's the last word of the book?
I'm sorry. Oh, Moses on the Mesa. That's why your finger was, Moses on the Mesa. So there, that captures something for you. It's not a very long film. I think it's 18 minutes long. So, it's worth, if you're interested in how this legendary is sort of popularized for recent audiences, it's not a bad film to check out. Okay, now, let's turn the clock back to the peak of American comic filmmaking and Mel Brooks. This is one of two comic interludes that I've incorporated into my talk, right? So Mel Brooks is the champion of demythologizing everything. And many of you are probably familiar with this brief clip from Blazing Saddles. But it's worth watching again, and I'll just tell you ahead of time, what I have in mind here is the way in which Mel Brooks, sort of pushing against the reputation of the West as a place of great heroes and conquests of good over versus evil. He racializes the West, racializes the history of the West, and puts Yiddish in the mouth of an Indian chief. So we'll watch this brief clip, and then we'll go on to our next moment. Let's see if I can find. I don't seem to have my cursor. Oh, there it is. There we go. Okay.
Now you tell me your story. What's a dazzling urbanite like you doing in a rustic setting like this?
If you really must pry.
Oh, I must.
Well, back in '56, my folks and I were part of this long wagon train moving west. Well, not exactly part of it. You might say we was bringing up the rear, when suddenly, from out of the west, came the entire Sioux Nation. And let me tell you, baby, they was open for business. Actually, the white folks didn't let us travel in their circle, so we made our own.
Schwarzes. No, seid nicht Mischugge. Laws im Gain! Kappa walk, it's all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Big
So I brought that to your attention, as I say, for the purposes of a comic interlude, but also just to introduce the idea that when you have a mythologized past, then you're inviting satire, and you're inviting all kinds of opportunity. It gives comedians opportunities to bend the history and shape it in a different direction. And that's, again, the advantage of thinking about how history is imagined as opposed to how history is represented by people who are trying to relay it, outside of the context of imagination. I'm going to bring us back to the more serious framework here, though. If I can advance. Whoops. How do we get out of here? I'm stuck on this slide. The little arrow. Sorry.
Now you
There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So one reason, there are two reasons I think that American Jews have maybe been overly distracted from thinking about the legacy of their early history in North America, and maybe have not devoted as much attention to it as I think is warranted, has to do with the way, and particularly since the 1970s, 80s, 90s, the way in which the Holocaust, the legacy of the Holocaust, has sort of taken over as a basis for Jewish identity, right? So you look at year after year of the Pew studies of American Jewish identity, and you ask American Jews, what gives you your sense of Jewish identity? Many American Jews will invoke the legacy of the Holocaust. Now, this isn't to say that the Holocaust doesn't matter from an American standpoint, or that we shouldn't have a Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C., but I like to remind audiences that, in fact, the Holocaust occurred in Europe, did not occur in North America, and so by focusing an undue amount of attention on that as a basis for American Jewish identity, we're sort of encouraging, American Jews are encouraging themselves to sort of abstract and maybe even repress the meaning and implications of early Jewish American history. Like the racial stuff doesn't matter because we have the Holocaust. The other source of distraction, if I can fairly call it a distraction, the other source of distraction, of course, is Israel, right? Which is another sort of basis point for American Jewish identity, is affiliation, shifting affiliations with the state of Israel, which, again, going back to 1948, has been a mainstay of American Jewish invocations of what it means to be an American Jew. And so my project is basically trying to remind us these stories are important, but they sometimes serve as distractions that take us out of where we need to be in terms of understanding, reframing, and grappling with the legacy of the American Jewish experience as a formative experience for American Jewish identity. Now, in the book, I talk about several episodes in early Jewish American history which have been popularized for different reasons in different ways. And one of the most interesting episodes to come up is this one. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this story. I think I tell the story because it is the kind of thing that begs to be popularized, begs to be fictionalized, begs to be sort of played around with. And as you'll hear, that is exactly what has happened. So in truth, on September 2nd, 1825, this man, Mordecai Emanuel Noah, declared a Jewish haven on the island in the Niagara River just outside Buffalo called Grand Island. He actually issued a proclamation inviting Jews from around the world to come to Buffalo, New York, and settle on this island. And this was going to be sort of, I mean, he didn't really define it politically, but I think it would have been a Jewish haven within the context of the American Republic. Well, what happened on September 2nd, 1825 is that not a single Jew came there. However, a couple hundred Buffalo Episcopalians did show up, and they laid that cornerstone. That's an actual cornerstone that you can look at the Buffalo History Museum. They laid the cornerstone, and that was as far as the experiment went. However, in the realm of the imagination, this episode has been interpreted and reinterpreted many different times by different people. So going back to Israel Zangwill, the English Jewish playwright, he features a story where his characters visit Grand Island looking for the ghost of Mordecai Emanuel Noah. More recently, and in my book I discuss it at great length, the New York-based Jewish graphic novelist Ben Ketcher published a book in 1999 called The Jew of New York, which is a reinterpretation of Mordecai Emanuel Noah's legacy, but really a really surreal depiction of that story that takes you very far away from Grand Island, but still delivers basically on that core idea of a Jewish haven in North America. And then I think most recently, 2006, an Israeli novelist named Nava Samel published a novel called Israel, which proposes the idea that, okay, not only did Noah bring Jews to the island, the Jews settled on the island, And that obviated the need for a state of Israel. It obviated, it eliminated there was no Holocaust. That didn't happen either. All because the Jews were safe on this island in upstate New York. And not only that, but Mordecai Manuel Noah, like this character I showed you from the film still, he marries a native woman, and they produce children who are sort of hybrid Jewish Native American people. And so the Jewish race in North America becomes indigenous. That way. So this moment, which really is just a moment, right? Not a single Jew shows up here. As a touchstone to the imagination, there are endless possibilities for it. And so a couple of the chapters in my book look at historical novels. In this case, I focus primarily on the Ben Ketcher book. But there you have it. So the other area that I get into in the book, and we'll talk in more detail about, is the curation of museums. So, of course, you have some historic congregations in North America congregations that go back to the early 1700s. In this case, Sherith Israel is the oldest congregation in North America. They claim that it was founded in 1654. It seems a little dubious because the first Jews to come to New Amsterdam arrive in 1654, and the evidence for their having established a congregation that early is pretty scant. But that's the claim that the synagogue makes in its online presence, and also if you tour their building. The original site for Sherith Israel is on what's now South William Street in Lower Manhattan. I was just there like 3 days ago, and it really is next to Luke's Lobster Shack. And I reproduced that photo for a reason. I wanted to show you the plaque that it shows you where the original synagogue was, but also to remind us all that we are always looking, when we think we're looking at the past, we're always looking at it through the lens of the present. And that juxtaposition is a good opportunity to be reminded of that. What you see on the right-hand side, so Sherith Israel has migrated north on the island of Manhattan over the generations, and their current synagogue, which I think dates to the 1890s, is on Central Park West and 69th Street. In that palatial Gilded Age building where the synagogue is located, there is a small room that they call the Little Synagogue, which is where furnishings from the original synagogues are sort of peppered throughout. And so if you visit the synagogue, if you visit Sherith Israel, you get a tour, they will show you this place, and these items from the early synagogue are very lovingly curated and shown as, again, evidence of an early Jewish presence in North America. Sherith Israel really emphasizes, and you'll see the next couple slides will show this, really emphasizes their contiguity with very important pivotal moments in American history. In other words, in such a way as to essentially inscribe Jews into the most pivotal moments of American history. And case in point would be the Revolutionary War. So the congregation's synagogue was in Lower Manhattan. Their burial ground, which still exists, is in current-day Chinatown at a place called Chatham Square. And most Memorial Days, the synagogue hosts a sort of a pageant wreath laying where members of the community are invited, members of the congregation are invited, and particularly family members who are genealogically descended from these same families will show up. They lay wreaths on the graves. They also will have a color guard and military reenactors representing units from the Revolutionary War, from the Civil War, and so on. The photo on the right there features the man on the left. I think in this picture, this man is now, I think when that photo was taken in 2018, he was in his early hundreds, and he was a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge. But what's interesting about his presence in that cemetery is that he has relatives buried in that same cemetery who served in the American Revolution. So there's the idea of a lineage, of a sort of an unbroken chain of Jewish lineage in North America. It's very important to Sherith Israel to promulgate that image and to remind people who come there that Jews are one and the same with the founding of the American Republic. That's part of their message. Just another image here of that same episode, that same commemoration episode in Chatham Square. I'll speak briefly now about Newport, right? So you have Jewish congregations, the earliest Jewish congregations are New York, Newport, Charleston, South Carolina. Philadelphia is in the mid-1700s. Newport is, of course, the one that is probably the most famous because it's the one where the building that was built in 1763 is still there, right? So it is absolutely a shrine to early Jewish American history. But here is where legendary takes over from history. So I want to recount one story in particular that I heard a few years ago. I was giving a talk about the history of the Newport Synagogue. I think it was a Zoom talk, and at the end of the talk, somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, "Can you tell me, is it true that the Jews first came to Newport at the end of the 1600s? The heyday of that community is around the Revolutionary War." And this person asked me, "Can you tell me, is it true that the Jews of Newport hid fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad in the mid-1800s?" I asked them to tell me more because I'd never heard this story. And they said, well, as in keeping with other Sephardic synagogues, there is in fact sort of a little crypt underneath the main floor in the synagogue. There's a little sort of cellar hole and a secret hatchway that goes down there. And the story that this person heard was that fugitive slaves were hidden in this crypt by the Jews, and the person went on to tell me that the reason that the Jews hid these escaped slaves is that naturally, as victims of the Inquisition, they carried their legacy forward. They were, they felt like a sort of common cause with escaped fugitive slaves, and so naturally they would do something like this. That's when I realized that there was absolutely no truth to this legend, the reason being that there were no Jews in Newport after 1800. The community was absolutely vacated of its Jewish presence, and Jews didn't really come back to Newport until 1880. However, the story has legs. After this person asked me about it, I looked it up and I found that there were two contemporary travel guides to Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts that tell people, visit the Newport Synagogue and ask them to show you where the Underground Railroad fugitives were hidden. I think what that tells us, what it tells me in any case, is that American Jews have a desire to be thought of as the allies of fellow victims of oppression, right? We want to be on the right side of history. The actualities of early Jewish American history point us in a different direction. For one thing, Newport was a slave port, right? And so, in fact, many of the early Jews who settled in Newport were slave traders. Not on a large scale, but they were engaged in the slave trade. They were slave owners. So whether or not by the mid-19th century these people would have been willing to hide fugitive slaves is moot because, again, they weren't there in the first place. So I think that's, again, an example of how our desires in the present drive the stories that we tell about the past, even when there's no evidence for those stories. Footnote to that, however, is that there is a plausible argument that fugitive slaves were hidden in the synagogue. However, it would have been Quakers who hid them there, because when the Jews left Newport in 1800, they gave the keys to a man named N.H. Gould, who was a prominent member of the Quaker community in Newport. And the Quakers, as we know, did hide fugitive slaves. So I think it's quite possible that people were hidden in that synagogue, but Jews had absolutely nothing to do with hiding them in that crypt. Another again, instance of a sort of legendary taking over, or sort of a popular interpretation taking over for actualities in history occurs in keeping with this sign here. So it's maybe difficult for you to see, but the sign in front of the synagogue in that garden there says Patriots Park. The sign was erected, I think, 15 years or so ago. And the sign beneath announcing that it's Patriots Park, the sign tells you that this park is dedicated to the memory and the legacy of the Jewish American patriots who served the American Revolution loyally in Newport during the 1770s. It's an interesting sign, it's an interesting interpretation. It leaves out the fact that about half of Newport's Jews were loyalists. Right? Those people don't get a park. Those people don't get a sign because they were on the wrong side of history. So interpreting history from a popular standpoint often involves deciding which side you want to be on of history and then going forward from that point of view. Mikveh Israel is a congregation right down the street from where I live in Philadelphia. In fact, I celebrated Passover there just about a week ago. This is obviously not an early American architectural specimen, but what I want to show you is this logo, which they devised around the time of the bicentennial. Yes, there were members of Mikveh Israel in the 1770s and 80s who were participants in the American Revolution, but at that time, I don't have to tell you that they did not call themselves the Synagogue of the American Revolution. This is an afterthought that comes in keeping with popular celebrations around the bicentennial. The Liberty Bell, of course, is the other icon here, and there's another story that goes along with that, which is that maybe 30 years or so ago, some evidence, which was problematic as it turned out, some evidence surfaced suggesting that the Liberty Bell's first arrival in Philadelphia occurred on board a ship that was owned by two Jewish merchants. And so this was a story that Mikveh Israel and the Jewish community of Philadelphia celebrated very widely for a period of time. Again, we're talking about the early 2000s, until they found out that the evidence was faulty. It wasn't on a Jewish ship at all. And a person wrote an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, this was about 15 years ago, saying, well, you know what, it doesn't matter, it didn't come on a Jewish ship because look at the lettering on the Liberty Bell. It's Hebrew. It's a quotation from Leviticus. So, in fact, we did influence the Liberty Bell after all. Our Bible did. Again, shifting interpretations. I also, in this book, spent some time looking at two house museums, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of house museums around the United States, and particularly in the South, there are dozens of plantations you can visit. But as far as I know, there are only two such places in the American South that were owned by Jewish families, and I visited two of them, the two that exist. One is the Mordecai House in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is pictured here. Interesting to me here is that that slide on the top tells you, in fact, the Mordecai House is by reputation haunted by ghosts. And I sort of, in writing about it, I wasn't really able to get, I mean, they'll tell you who the ghost is and why she haunts the house and so on. But for me, it was sort of an apt metaphor, because what I found in studying this house and the other one that I'll show you in just a minute is that the real ghosts in this case are they're basically two ghosts in terms of how the story is told. One ghost is the presence of anything Jewish in the house. So you walk into this house, that is the parlor in the Mordecai house. There isn't a single item of Jewish origin in the house. This was a family that did everything they possibly could to assimilate into Southern culture. In fact, by the time that the owner of this house bought it, he had converted to Christianity. So this was a house, this was the home of a Jewish family that had essentially let go of its Jewish heritage and owned not a single artifact that would speak to that heritage. The other ghost, again, visiting these houses, going on their tours, understandably and for good reasons, both of these houses, the curators of both of these houses do everything they can to bring to life the lives of the Southern, the African-American slaves who served these places, right? The Mordecai House, I think there were something like 150 or 200 enslaved people who worked their fields, right? Those people are also ghosts, but for a different reason. They're ghosts because none of the owners cared about who they were, didn't record their names. We don't know what they did. We don't know where they were buried. We don't know where they lived. So they're basically the people curating these two Southern Jewish homes are chasing after two different types of ghosts. The other home I visited is the Moses Myers House in Norfolk, which is a lovely museum, a fantastic museum of just a great collection of early American artifacts, including some paintings that were once in the White House. What you see here are portraits of three family members. But again, Moses Myers, now he did not convert. He retained his Jewishness throughout his life. However, not a single item in this house, there isn't a menorah, there isn't a candlestick, there isn't anything that tells you, there's not any physical evidence of this family's Jewish identity. We supply that ourselves. We know that they were Jewish, and so we go to that house looking for a Jewish presence, and it's not really physically visible. At the same time, the Moses Myers House does what it can to archaeologically, try to tell the stories of the African American people who served there. But again, there's not much that can be delivered, right? Because that history is hidden, was buried away by people who just didn't care to record it. All right, now the last part of the book I'm going to talk about was, for me, the most interesting part for me to write. And that was the part in which I decided I was going to track down the living descendants of early American Jewish families. And I was fortunate to find about a dozen people and interview them so that I could tell their stories in the book. And because I figured genealogy, right, is an extremely popular pastime. In terms of popular pastimes, apparently it's second to gardening for Americans, so genealogy is a beloved pastime. Jews are no exception to that. It goes back to the days of Roots, I think, the 1970s, right? So genealogy is a method by which, let's say, a non-scholarly audience, an audience of non-specialists, can delve into and engage the meaning of its history. I found this book, Finding Our Fathers. This is sort of the Bible of Jewish American genealogy. Incidentally, the man who wrote that book, Dan Rottenberg, is famous for that book, and also because he was the person who coined the term yuppie in 1980. So how did that happen? But even before Rottenberg came along, there were Jewish genealogists, like the people who published this journal here on the left-hand side, the St. Charles. Now, you've heard of the Blue Books, you've heard of the Mayflower Register ideas, these ideas of elite Anglo-Americans collecting the names of their ancestors and sort of assorting themselves out socially in accordance with their genealogy. Well, Jews were not immune to this. This publication is from 1935, and the St. Charles is invoking essentially the ship that at that time was believed to have brought those first Jews to New Amsterdam in 1654. We now know it was not called the St. Charles, but in 1935, that was what the evidence suggested. And the St. Charles was invoked as, quote, the Jewish Mayflower. And so the contents of this journal are essentially articles about these early American Jews delivered to an audience of people who were related to those people, who wanted to invoke that history with pride and perhaps put themselves on a level with the other Anglo, their Anglo neighbors who could do the same thing with the legacy of the Mayflower. So the DAR, believe it or not, now, right, you remember the DAR would not let Marian Anderson sing at the Lincoln Memorial. Well, they've come a long way because now they have a Researching Your Jewish Patriot page. And in fact, when I gave this talk a few weeks ago online, I had an audience of DAR members in Louisville, Kentucky, who were very eagerly, because they knew I was going to do a shout out to the DAR. So there is that possibility. By the same token, they also have a Researching Your African American Patriot, right? So this genealogy is alive and well, and it's another means by which people who are lineally descended from earlier American Jews can engage their earlier history. Birmingham's book was published in the early 70s. It's not a reliable historiographic work by any means, but it's full of fascinating gossip about particularly these very wealthy Jewish American matrons who live on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan in the middle of the 20th century, and how they draw upon their elite status as the progeny of early American Sephardim. All right, now I want to tell you about some of the families I met. So the Seixas Solomons clan is a fascinating group, and just about every one of the greatest hits from early Jewish American history can be found in this family chart. Gershom Mendes Seixas, who I mentioned earlier, right, he's the guy who authored that 1800 commencement speech. He's on here, so is Emma Lazarus, so is Haim Solomon. These people are all related to each other, and fortunately I was able to I met 3 members of that family a few years ago. One of them, Don Green, passed away about a year and a half ago. He is visiting Gershom Mendes Seixas' grave in Chatham Square in this photograph, which was taken maybe 10 years or so ago. So I met him and spoke to him. And basically what I did is I interviewed these people and I asked them, what does your early Jewish American lineage mean to you today? How do you interpret it? Is it important to you? I also met his two sons, one of whom is Aryeh. And I don't know about you, but I think that the resemblance between Aryeh and his great-great-great-great-grandfather, Gershom Mendes Seixas, is pretty remarkable. And I think that Aryeh must think so too. That's why he posed for that photograph at Mikveh Israel. But again, I interviewed Aryeh and asked him what this history means to him. And he gave me very interesting responses, mostly saying, well, I understand that American history means different things to people now. You know, I understand that Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. I understand that the legacy of this history means different things to us now, but it still matters to me. I still think that these people set a meaningful and positive example. I also met some people in Charleston, South Carolina. And in particular, this is a person that actually Jonathan was there with me. We toured the cemetery in Charleston, the Jewish cemetery in Charleston, with this woman. The difference between Anita Moise Rosenberg and the progeny of the Solomon Seixas group is that in Anita's case, her family came to Charleston in 1790 and they never left, right? So she is an 8th or 9th generation Jewish Charlestonian. She's posing here with her ancestor, Penina Moise, who, if you don't know much about her, I will just tell you, Penina Moise was a beloved poetess of the Confederacy, right? And so here again, for Anita Moise and Rosenberg, what does it mean to her to be lineally descended from this person? Well, she obviously is proud of her ancestor, notwithstanding her recognition of how problematic it is to embrace that history. So when you go back and you want to re-invoke history, you have to be aware that the meaning of that history changes all the time, and the implications of embracing it shift through time. And this woman's story, I think, is a powerful example of that. Now, Keith Stokes is a fascinating story. He is a public official in the state of Rhode Island, lives in Newport, works in Providence. And Keith Stokes was, when I was putting out a call for potential informants for this project, somebody said, well, you should contact Keith Stokes because Keith Stokes has Jewish ancestors in Newport. And so I was introduced to an African-American man who indeed very proudly can point to his Jewish ancestry. And the story, I'll try to deliver it as briefly as possible here. So in Newport in the 1770s and 1780s, Newport is invaded by the British during the Revolutionary War. And so the Jews, I mentioned most of the Jews who were not loyalists left Newport. And so members of the Hayes family leave Newport, they go to Boston. And so a man named Moses Michael Hayes, who's the earliest Jewish settler in Boston, permanent Jewish settler in Boston, he goes there in the 1770s, and he has two daughters, Catherine and Slowey Hayes, and Catherine and Slowey Hayes never marry. It's around 1810 or so, their father, Moses, has died, and Catherine and Slowey moved to Richmond, Virginia, where they have a brother who is helping to establish a Jewish congregation in Richmond. So the two sisters move to Richmond, live with their brother, and their brother's son, the man pictured on the left there, is a special case. They do what they can to kind of support him in his education. He ends up having an out-of-wedlock affair with a free black woman, and that affair produces the man in the middle, Richard Gustavus Forrester. Richard Gustavus Forrester as the father of the person on the right-hand side. This is a black family that has Jewish roots, that has deep Richmond roots. And Keith Stokes is related to them. In fact, what happened is eventually, I think sometime around World War I, the Forresters left Richmond and moved back to Newport, right? And Keith Stokes, although he is an Episcopalian, is a member of the board of the Touro Synagogue and is very actively involved in Jewish life in Rhode Island. But some, sort of salient points to be made here is if you're looking at the connections, the genealogical connections of early American Jews, you have to remember to factor in race, right? You have to remember to factor in the racial complexities of American history. You also have to factor in conversion, right? Because many of the living descendants of early American Jews are not Jewish, right? Some of them are. Anita Moyes Rosenberg is, Aryeh Green is, but some of them have converted, and so that's part of the legacy. Part of the legacy is a legacy of conversion. Now, the story that Keith told me got a little bit deeper when I asked him, after I interviewed him, I said, is there anyone else who I should talk to, who I should interview? And he said, well, there are this brother and sister, Drury and Armistead Welford. They live in Richmond, and I just found out, Keith told me this, he told me this maybe 3 or 4 years ago. He said, I just found out they are my cousins, right? Because they too, also Richmond Episcopalians, their family converted to Episcopalianism right after the Civil War, right? They too are lineally descended from Newport Jews. And really only recently did they find out about this lineage, and now they celebrate it, right? Now it means something to them. And it also brought them into contact with Keith. In fact, when Drury Welford first contacted Keith, maybe 10 years ago, she said that the subject line in her email to him was, hey, you're my cousin, right? So there's a lot of intermingling that goes on here. And this story of early Jewish American history is really, just like all American stories, it's really a complicated story that crosses racial boundaries, that crosses religious boundaries, and really has profound implications for American history in general. Now, more comic relief, right? I promised you 2 episodes of comic relief, and I don't think that I could sum things up any better than this little clip from Larry David. If you've seen this already, kudos to you. If you haven't, this is fantastic and really gets to the heart of really what my book is about: the surprises, the discomfiture, the complexity of it all. So you may be familiar with the TV show Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates. So there's an episode from 2017 where Larry David shows up as a guest, and Henry Louis Gates confronts Larry David with the truth of his origins. So let's see if I can bring my cursor up there, if I can awaken it.
It's just such an odd combination on my father's side of the Germany and the South.
Yeah.
2 places that we have fought against as a country.
Yeah, right.
Oh my goodness. I hope no slaves show up on this.
Please turn the page. Now, Larry, this is another part of the 18th century.
Oh, you did it! You did it! I knew it! I knew it! Unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Boy.
That's unbelievable.
Oh boy. Name of the slave owner, Henry Bernstein. My great-grandfather was a slave owner. Slaves, 1 female, age 4, 1 female, age 17, mulatto. Oh, Professor, I'm so sorry.
I love the fact that Larry David does that cringeworthy thing he always does, in apologizing, which is so ridiculous, but also really heartfelt. But it really gets to the heart of the awkwardness of all of this, right? When we look deeply at early Jewish American history, we find out things that we may not want to know about, and yet, what choice do we have? We have to reckon with them. And so the way that Larry David chooses in this moment to reckon with that, I think, is quite poignant, actually. All right, so finally I get to the end, and now we'll explain the image on the cover of the book. Remember, I was telling you about Ararat, this experiment, this Jewish refuge that never happened. So in 2012, there was a group of computer artists at the University of Toronto who decided to create an augmented reality project where they would create a tour, a walking tour of Grand Island. You could go to Grand Island and you bring your phone or your tablet with you, and you would walk the precincts of Grand Island, and you would hold your phone up and you would see things that aren't really there, right? You would see things that would be there had it become a Jewish refuge. So this pair of children is standing in front of the grave of Mordecai Emanuel Noah, who is in fact buried in Queens, New York, right? But through the screen of their tablet, what they're seeing is his grave. And the image on the cover of the book depicts a synagogue that also isn't there, right? Because, in fact, what you're looking at is a golf course. And the authors of this experiment, in the article they wrote, they make a point which, for me, is really maybe really wraps it up more beautifully than anything else. They say, well, go take this tour. Imagine what it would have been like if Jews had lived here. But be careful, because if you step out to look at the image of the synagogue, you might get hit in the head by a golf ball. And the reason I think that's important is what they're doing is they're reminding us that we're always looking at the past through the lens of the present, right? You are never glimpsing the past through anything except where you are at the very moment that you're standing there. And being worried about a golf ball hitting you in the head is a good way of being reminded that you're in the present, not the past. And so every attempt you make to imagine the past is just that. It's an attempt which has great meaning and implications, but it is not the same thing as discovering the true secrets of history. I will end it there, and I think there should be time for questions. Thank you very much.
Responses, questions for Professor Hoberman?
And do you see anything about Jewish migration in America? Whoops. Did you hear?
Jewish migration in America. So, sure. Like, are you interested in a particular period or?
Well, starting, I guess, with the American Revolution.
Okay, sure. No, I'm happy to do that. So, I was telling some people before the talk started that the earliest Jewish communities in North America were basically fed by Jewish communities in two cities in Europe, Amsterdam and London. Right? There were significant populations, first of Sephardim and then also of Central European Jews, Ashkenazim, in both London and Amsterdam. And so when Jews first came to North America at the time of the Revolution, before the Revolution, and the period immediately afterwards, they mostly came by way of those communities, but very often they first, really, people who do early Jewish American history will tell you that the Caribbean matters more than North America, right? So some of the most significant early Jewish communities in the New World are in places like Jamaica, Barbados, Curacao. Also, really, the first Jewish settlement in the Americas is in Recife in Brazil. The Jews who came to New Amsterdam in the 1650s came there from Brazil, in fact. But really, the communities that created this migration were these congregations in those two, I mean, not entirely, but largely those two cities, those two cosmopolitan centers. England readmitted Jews in the 1650s unofficially, right? So there was a Jewish population in London as early as the 1650s, Amsterdam a little bit earlier than that. These are both, Protestant countries that practiced, some version of religious tolerance, and that's why Jews came from those places. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
Michael, thanks so much for a great talk. So I was a little bit unclear about kind of the argument of the book. What I heard in the talk was that there are at least two major meta-narratives that seem to be quite forceful in terms of shaping how Jews have imagined early America. And one is kind of a story about patriotism and loyalty and connection and fidelity to the principles of the American Republic. Yeah. And the other is kind of a lost cause narrative. I mean, you didn't say it explicitly, but touring that cemetery in South Carolina, we very much heard that lost cause narrative, and like the image of the book about Confederate Jews gives you that lost cause narrative in an image. Do I get that right? But also, like, are there other major meta-narratives that shaped the imagining of early America? And is the point of the book to kind of demythologize these narratives, or what is kind of the larger takeaway that you wanted us to get from?
So first, I would say that the lost cause narrative and the let's call it the patriot narrative, they're sort of a piece with each other, right? Because they're both invoking some of the same ideas, which are of Jewish loyalty, whether it's to the early republic or to the Confederacy, for that matter. So that's one of the narratives, and then the other narrative is the more complicated narrative that sort of falls apart now when we look back at those stories and we look back at the legacy of Jewish slave owners or Jews who may be displaced Native American people. That same history that Jews embraced with pride a few generations ago means something different, right? And so people create mechanisms by which they can cope with the shifting meanings. So hence you have Larry David's, sort of shock and surprise and embarrassment. So I don't know what that other narrative is, but I think, something that informs all of this is an assumption on the part of many American Jews that we've always been on the right side of history, of American history. We're natural allies of the oppressed. And then when you go deeper and look at some of these episodes in early Jewish American history, you find out that, well, no, right? Not necessarily, right? Not necessarily. So I think that's to get to what the main narratives are. That's those. In terms of the attempt to demythologize, I'm not so interested in demythologizing it as I am in saying, look, these are myths. Let's remember to understand the distinction between myths and non-myths. And as is the case with any myth, why does it matter to us? What does it mean about us that we tell these stories in the ways that we tell them? That's really what I'm trying to do and also, I guess, cope with what I understand to be the reality, which is that the reception on the part of American Jews to their history is mostly mediated through these popular sources, right? Most American Jews who learn about Haim Solomon are not learning about him from Jonathan Sarna, all right, or great scholars. They're learning about him from postage stamps, right? So it's important for us to take those postage stamps seriously and think about what they mean, right? Not necessarily to debunk them, but just to say, look, this is what we're doing here. We're interpreting a history. We're not actually delivering the history directly. I don't know if that addresses what you're asking.
Thank you very much for a really, should I say, titillating talk. It brought up so many questions in my mind, but these are really important themes, I think, that bring attention to Jewish identity and the struggle Jews have in trying to figure out what their identity is and where they belong. And so that seems to me part of the heart of your story is where do Jews belong? Two of the myths that I wonder if you're dealing with is, one is about being rich, capitalists. Do Jews celebrate themselves for being wealthy? And how is that played out? I mean, other people accuse Jews of being wealthy for bad reasons, but is there a Jewish identity of being, it's good that we're wealthy?
Well, I think it's a complicated and sort of paradoxical situation where you want to celebrate success, right? Jewish American success is worth celebrating, but if that success happens, let's say, at the expense of others, then it's not something to be celebrated. But one of the things that your question is bringing to mind for me in terms of sort of iconic figures and the idea of wealth. So back to Haim Solomon, right? Not to beat a dead horse here, but the story with Haim Solomon that is very often told, right? He was a man of, significant but not enormous wealth, but significant enough wealth that he's loaning money to the Continental Congress. So a story that is very often told and repeated about him is that, in fact, he never was repaid, right? He loaned from just out of pure generosity, and he never received repayment for these massive loans that he delivered. So to me, what that tells is, on the one hand, here, yes, we're associated with wealth, but you know what? More important than the wealth was the loyalty to the Republic and the willingness to part with that wealth for the betterment of the revolution.
I thought the story about the privateers was very intriguing. But my other question, the other myth I was wondering about, if it's a myth, is how did they celebrate being Jews? I mean, were these Sephardic? Did they actually have Passover and Shabbat or things like that?
Sure. I mean, when you go into the history, you find a lot of examples of Jews who are actively participating in Jewish life, in the holiday cycle, who participate and contribute to congregations going back very early, right? There's plenty of evidence for that, but there's also a lot of evidence for, particularly when you look at Jews in smaller communities, like I showed you pictures of the Moses Myers house in Norfolk. Well, Moses Myers and his family were the only Jews in Norfolk in 1800. Right, and so he corresponds with other Jews. Like, you can find letters that he writes back and forth, sometimes invoking Jewish holidays in his correspondence. But he and his family members had absolutely no means to create a Jewish life in Norfolk because there was no community, right? And so that's true for the more outlying communities. I think you see less Jewish observance. But there are plenty of examples of, well, again, I mean, this woman, Anita Rosenberg, her family retained its Jewishness in one place for 200 plus years, right? And that's partly, I think, owing to, right, they've been members of the same congregation going back to the 1790s. Her family members have participated in that single congregation that entire time. So I think proximity to institutions is an enormous factor here, right? But the stories of conversion, which occur, right, fairly frequently, those are the stories that people are less, for whatever reasons, maybe not very good reasons, are less proud of, right? They're sort of embarrassing stories to some people. Why would we want to? That's why the Keith Stokes thing is so interesting to me, is that here's a family where the Jewish trace is long gone, and yet it comes up in a place we don't expect it to come up. But those stories are still part of the fabric of that history. Yeah, you're welcome. There's somebody in the back, too.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a quick follow-up question to these.
Yeah.
The loyalty, fidelity narrative is so strong. And on the religion and politics thing, one of the questions I have, so one of the things I study in the period is the sort of sense of a Protestant internationale. So there's this group of people who think of themselves more as Protestant than, say, as American, or more Protestant than they are. So is there also a counter-narrative of saying, we're primarily Jewish and we're related to a Jewish congregations worldwide, and yeah, we're American too, but we're primarily Jewish? Or is the push always to be, look how American we are, even though we're Jewish, or something?
I think that's thanks for that question, Abram. I think that for the most part, you begin to see that sort of Jewish, the worldwide Jewish narrative, I think, is more a phenomenon of the post-Civil War period, right? And that's because rabbinical scholarship in the United States has developed by that time. You have much stronger influences from particularly places like Germany, people who are actually, most of the leaders of these early Jewish congregations were not trained rabbis, right? The first rabbi in North America, the first officially ordained rabbi in North America doesn't show up until the 1840s, right? So these are communities that it's not that they're nominally Jewish, they participate actively in Jewish life, and they have communication back and forth with their sister congregations, whether in Jamaica or London and so on. But I don't think, I think it's very important, particularly in the context of North America, where you have a revolutionary war that establishes a separate republic. I think that sort of Jewish internationalism is not really a factor until later on. That's my overall take on it. And then it becomes a big factor, right? Then you have big arguments on this, right? And huge schisms within the Jewish American world. Is our Americanism more important, or is our Jewishness more important? But it comes up later. Particularly another sort of case in point here is the earliest development of the Zionist movement. Late 19th century. It creates a huge crisis in the American Jewish community because the more assimilated, the types of the Jewish families that I'm talking about mostly here, most of them are bitterly opposed to Zionism. And they're opposed to it because they think that America is their Zion, right? In fact, there are sermons that basically deliver that exact message. And so when Jews in certain, places, in connection with maybe more Orthodox practices, it's mostly the Reform Jews who are against Zionism. When the more Orthodox practitioners who have, let's say, closer ties to European Jewish communities, when they are propounding the cause of Zionism, they're doing it against a countercurrent of, no, we don't need another country. This is our country, right? But that's all like, post-Civil War, really.
I was wondering what early means to you, and how different the book would be if it was just imagining American Jews. Because it seems like these two narratives, like the Patriot narrative, the Lost Cause narrative, are not that different from like how we imagine, American Jews more broadly. So yeah, I guess chronology.
Yeah, thanks for that question. For me, early, I define early as basic. I should have, maybe I should have said so, and I'm not sure that I even say so in the book, frankly. But basically, early to me is before the Eastern European migrations of the 1880s, right? So the period before then, so essentially the period between the colonial, what we call the colonial era, and the end of the Civil War. That's what I focus on primarily. And I guess the reason I do that is because when you focus on those years, you're looking at really sort of, you're looking at the building blocks of American mythology that transcends whether you're talking about Jews or Gentiles. You're talking about episodes like the Revolution. You're talking about phenomena like slave owning, the settlement of the frontier. These are all pre-late 19th century phenomena that symbolically, I think for me, represent an affiliation with, the original ideas of America, the Anglo-American versions of it. Jewish engagement with that. Thanks.
My mother's side of the family is Sephardic Jamaican Jews. Could you expound on that a little bit in terms of the proportion of Jamaican Jews versus from Amsterdam and London?
So the Jews of Jamaica there's some, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I'll mention a book that you might be interested in called, what is it? The author of the book is Stan Mervis, and it's a study of Jews in Jamaica in the 18th century, primarily. Recent book published by Yale University Press maybe 5 years or so ago. But essentially the Jews who come to Jamaica are basically London Jews for the most part, right? Because Jamaica is an English colony. And they are the stories that Mervis tells in this book are really interesting because they introduce the idea of Jewish plantation owners, right? Even in the American South, I showed you some images of, at least the Mordecai house was, what you'd call a plantation house. But most Jews in the American South, including the slave-owning Confederate type Jews, were not plantation owners, right? They tended to be merchants, just the way Jews in the North were. But Jamaica was somewhat of an exception to that there was a Jewish planter class there. I'm mostly drawing upon my familiarity with Mervis's research because I don't really talk about Jamaica very much in this book, but it's one of these instances where he describes the Jews of Jamaica in the 18th century as people really living on the margins, so to speak, of whiteness, and on the margins of whiteness, right? They have the privilege of being able to own slaves. They have the privilege of being able to own land, but they do not have civic privileges. They can't vote. They have to, so they have, their rights are circumscribed by virtue of their Jewishness in certain areas, but they do have basically ownership and economic rights. And that's sort of a point of distinction, because what sets the North American colonies apart from places like Jamaica is that, particularly in the wake of the American Revolution, American Jews are invested with the power to run for office, to vote, and so on. So there is a difference there. Yeah, thanks. I did interview there's I don't know, maybe you know if you have those roots, there's the Henriquez family. There are, I don't know, dozens and dozens of Henriquezes in Jamaica. Some of them are black, some of them are white. I interviewed a member of that family whose roots in Jamaica go back to, again, early 18th century. Yeah, so there are people, there are people who carry that genealogy who are still in Jamaica, part of the fabric of Jamaica. Yes?
Maybe this doesn't cover that period. Do you have anything about the establishment of a Jewish hospital in St. Louis?
I wish I did. I don't know. That's a blind spot for me. In fact, the Midwest is, I hate to admit it, but the Midwest is a big blind spot for me. So thanks for inviting me to come here. Yeah, is there something that I should know about it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm solely on speculation. I'm guessing, right? I mean, I shouldn't even do this because what do I know? But my assumption is that the Jews of St. Louis probably go back to the 1840s, right? I think Jews in many of the cities of the Midwest date to roughly the 1840s, a large migration of German Jews that came to the United States around that time. So that would be my guess. That's true for Chicago. It's true for Cincinnati. Maybe it's true here too. But you can find answers from someone other than me. I'm not qualified. But thanks.
So the first Jewish hospital in Europe before the colonies is in 1747. And I have a study on the first Jewish hospital, Bet Holim Hospital in London. And then after the London one, there was one in the colonies, and I forgot when, exactly. But if you Google Julia Lieberman, the London Sephardic community, you will find the history of the first Jewish hospital in Europe before the colonies, 1747.
You know what? It's also coming to mind for me that remember I mentioned this guy Samson Simpson, the young Columbia graduate, 1800. He is the founder of Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. So, and that's an early. I think that's the earliest North American Jewish hospital, whose founding dates to, I believe, to the 1830s or 40s. Yeah, yeah. So he went on to bigger things than giving commencement speeches.
Well, we have had plenty of food for the soul and the mind, and now what waits us is another kind of refreshment outside. Let us again thank you
all.
Professor
Thanks so much.
Hoberman.
Thanks for your great questions. I do have a handful of books here, by the way. My wife would kill me if I didn't tell you that I have books with me, so I'm not trying to push them, but I have a few. So if you want one, you can see me about that.